Hello, and welcome to Book Circle Presents The Abigail Incident. We left our heroes, Gus and Doug, having arrived in the town of Abigail, starting their investigations into unexplained magical activity. They followed the map toward the school for a couple of blocks, then, with one accord, made a series of right turns through the town's neat little grid of streets and approached the mayor's neighbor from behind. "Fake name," said Doug while on their walk. "Why do you say that?" "Dolores Graves." "They're both real names," Gus said. "Yes, but Dolores means sorrowful. Put it together with Graves and give it to the reclusive resident of the creepy house, and it smells." Gus nodded comprehension. "Name magic?" he asked. Doug shrugged. They knew name magic existed, but nothing more. Their circuit brought them by the house of Dolores Graves' backyard neighbor. "Wish we'd learned to turn into sparrows or something like that," said Gus. "None of our shapes are at all that great for spying." Doug nodded and did his best to scope out the area without looking conspicuous, as did Gus. There was a tall wooden fence between the Graves' backyard and the neighboring backyard. While the neighbor had a respectable yellow siding, a mown lawn, and bits of garden, the Graves' house from this side showed the same peeling white and curtained windows. Tips of tall weeds barely cleared the fence. The neighbor on the opposite side from Mayor Blackmore was defended by another fence. "I predict," said Gus, "that the backyard is packed solid with weeds, and being sparrows wouldn't give us a lot more information unless you felt inclined to fly down the chimney." "You're probably right. Let's make ourselves honest and go see the school." On their walk, they called Theano again, this time on Gus's phone. She was delighted when they relayed their experiences. "I don't suppose you could go back and get her full name, maybe birth date?" I think that'd be more a matter of cat burgling than chatting up the town clerk," said Gus. "You're in a better position to cyberstalk this Dolores Graves than we are," Doug said. "I suppose so," said Theano glumly. "I got her house number," Doug offered and recited it. Theano thanked him perfunctorily. "We'll try to figure out a reason to hang around town, at least overnight," said Gus. "That's when she comes out." "And night is your best time," added Theano brightly. "Huh," Gus grunted. "Neither man nor dragon cat nor cave lion is really inconspicuous," Doug pointed out, "even in the dark." "But you can see in the dark," Theano countered. "I'm sure you'll do fine," she said with the bright confidence of one who does not have to do it. They said goodbye and sauntered on to the school. It was a small, flat building between thinly spaced housing and cornfields. The schoolyard had recently been treeless, though 3 young trees were practicing shading the grounds now. They surveyed the place critically. "If we did bring the circus here," said Doug, "there'd be plenty of room, and maybe they'd let us hook up to the plumbing." "Kids get a kick from doing unschool stuff at school," Gus remarked, "if we're really coming back here." "Depends on what's going on with Dolores, I suppose," said Doug. "I mean, if she's building a mad science superweapon in her basement or training her weeds to attack on command, and we can't thwart her, we'll want to call in the whole gang. Otherwise, I guess Theano and Rook just decide on non-magical grounds if it's worth a stop." Professor Rook, Dennis Vogel, was the other owner-manager of the Windy City Fantasy Circus. The circus was a front. It was a real business and put on real shows, but it was staffed by folk with magical talents and sought out towns where magical trouble was brewing, as determined by Theano and Rook using their own talents. The circus folk then coped with whatever they found. Doug and Gus schemed a little as they made their way back to the park and town hall. There, instead of visiting Catherine Crowell again, they went to the police station, tucked into a quarter of the bottom floor. There they found a middle-aged cop, tall, with little girth and less hair, sitting behind a desk with a sign that said he was Police Chief Granger Evertson. He looked at them curiously. He looked a little longer at Doug, since Asians were not thick on the ground of the Great Plains, but Doug detected no hostility in the glance. Nevertheless, he left it to Gus to start. "Hello, sir. We wanted to introduce ourselves. I'm Gus Weiskopf." "I'm Doug Chiang." "We're not vagrants, but we're on a long hike. We're on our way to Great Bend to meet up with our employers." Gus proffered one of the circus business cards. "You are on a long hike," Evertson agreed, taking the card. "Where from?" "A little town up in the Rockies." "Very long," Evertson said, and waited. "Yes, sir. So the thing is, we'd like a little rest. We'd like to stay in Abigail a couple of nights, but as you might guess, since we're hiking so much, we'd rather not spend money on lodging. Is there a place around here where it's okay for us to camp?" Evertson cocked his head, registering a little surprise. Well, can I see some ID?" They pulled out wallets and produced driver's licenses. Evertson examined these, then took them over to a printer and copied them. As he returned them, he observed to Doug, "American, then?" Doug nodded. "Fourth generation, from Chicago. There's a big Chinatown there." "Me too," said Gus. "Well, Chicago, not Chinatown. We met on the bus out of Chicago to Fort Leonard Wood." Evertson's eyes lit, and he nodded. Now he had a category for them: Army buddies. And by now he had had time to think about Gus's question. "I don't know of anywhere in town you can camp," he said, "but that's in town. You been camping out?" They nodded. "Not much choice a lot of the time," Doug added. "Well, if you don't mind camping out again, once you're outside the town line, you're out of my jurisdiction, and I doubt the state cops will know or care if you just refrain from stealing chickens or like that." This last was said with a smile. They smiled back. "Restaurant food was one of the things we were looking forward to," Gus said. Evertson nodded. "Town line closest to downtown is to the east." "Thank you, sir," said Doug. "What do you do in this circus?" "We're performers, acrobats," said Doug. "That's why the hair and whiskers. Costuming." And he repeated the rundown Gus had given Mrs. Kroll. "Knights and monsters," Evertson repeated. "And monster knights? What's that?" "In modern fantasy," said Doug, "the good guys aren't always human. You know, like Treebeard or that talking raccoon. So we reused the costumes for the monsters to play monster knights. People like the novelty." He tried to keep his tone relaxed and not too glib, but this question was nicely in line with their scheming. "Want to see a demonstration?" Gus asked on cue. Evertson blinked and grinned. "That's mighty generous of you." Gus shrugged. "Makes it easier for you to believe us. It's a little hard, right?" "Well, and maybe we drum up a little goodwill for the circus." "All right. You mean to do this outside?" "Yes, sir. It takes a lot of room." "Is there a men's room nearby where we can get into costume?" Doug asked. "You brought your costumes?" "Yes, sir. You see, we were off taking training. We have enough of our costumes for a demonstration." Doug left it to Evertson to suppose that the training and the costumes were related. A few minutes later, motion out of the window caught Catherine Kroll's eye. Looking, she saw two figures in mottled gray racing out into the park. Given her meeting with Gus and Doug earlier in the morning, she assumed these two were them, but the more she looked, the more puzzled she became. These figures did not look human, not entirely. They had tails, for a start, long, tufted, and leonine. Their heads had muzzles and pointed ears. The long hair and side whiskers enhanced the leonine effect. And they carried swords and shields. Not that this was inhuman, but it was certainly unusual. It was the swords, though, that convinced her these must be the two young fellows from the circus. And, bestial faces or not, one was black-haired and the other sandy brown. It must be them. She couldn't see any more detail from here, but that was readily fixed. She exited the town hall and was reassured to see Chief Evertson standing there, watching with interest but no concern. "What's going on?" she asked him. "A demonstration," he told her, "to prove to me they really are acrobats, they tell me, and to do a little advertising for their circus." "Ooh." Gus hammered with his sword on his shield for attention and roared, "Roll up, roll up, roll up!" At least it sounded like Gus. The sword was short but looked very convincing. The shield was small and round, a buckler the size of a serving tray, blue with a golden lion on it. Doug whirled his sword over his head so that it glittered in the sunlight and thundered, "Ladies and gentlemen, young and old, draw nigh and see a demonstration of swordsmanship from the Windy City Fantasy Circus." He held his own buckler high and pounded it. It was silver with a red lion on it. "We are the Lion Knights of East and West," Gus declaimed. "I am Augustus, the Knight of the West." "I am Sheng Ming, the Knight of the East," Doug declared. It was the middle of a workday, so there were not many adults in the park, but it was summer, so there were several children. They gathered around readily. The town hall began emptying. People started calling friends on their phones. Doug and Gus circled each other back to back, facing the growing crowd, pounding shields and whirling swords in alternation while they waited for the numbers to max out. In the meanwhile, Mrs. Kroll and Chief Evertson studied the two knights, comparing them to Gus and Doug as they had seen them chatting in the town hall. Their faces were muzzled, very short muzzles, no longer than their noses had been, and lavishly supplied with cat whiskers reaching as wide as their shoulders. The ears were mounted rather higher than human ones, had their own whiskers protruding from them cat fashion, and twitched every once in a while. They were breathing hard, so their mouths were open, showing fangs. "It must be hell in those masks," Mrs. Kroll remarked. Evertson nodded silently, still staring. When Gus and Doug had visited his office, he had estimated their heights to himself out of constabulary habit at around 6 feet each, and their driver's licenses confirmed this. But now they looked even bigger. 7 feet? It was hard to tell at a distance, and with both moving. He checked their feet for high-heeled boots, but their feet looked bare. They also looked leathery, scaly, like alligator hide, so those had to be shoes, but the heels were as flat as could be. Their garments were a bit of a puzzle. "They're not dressed like knights," Mrs. Kroll remarked. Each wore loose pants and short robes, a karate gi, in fact, only mottled gray, not plain white. Where throats, chests, and arms were left bare, the skin again looked like alligator hide, though colored normally. "They could just as well be dragon knights as lion knights," Evertson remarked. Mrs. Kroll nodded. "Those costumes must be hell. They look so real. How do they do that?" Evertson shook his head. Out on the lawn, Doug and Gus were not suffering hell in their costumes because their costumes consisted of nothing but their gi. They were, however, at pains to keep moving and keep their distance to make it hard to realize how big they now were. Hammering the bucklers would get old soon. "Do we have enough?" Gus asked. "As many as we're going to get, I think," Doug answered. "How about those two girls standing together, the gigglers, at 3 o'clock for you?" "Sure." Gus and Doug broke into a run straight at the two girls, who both looked about 15. 20 feet away, the Lion Knights dove into a tumble, a series of somersaults, with their bucklers tucked to their chests and their swords held out like axles. They ended 2 yards away from the girls, kneeling, bucklers before them, swords driven synchronously into the grass. "Fair maidens," Doug declaimed good and loud, "the custom is that knights should fight bearing the tokens of their ladies." "May we ask tokens of you?" Gus asked just as loud. The girls were no longer giggling, but staring open-mouthed. They started to look confused. "Just pick us a dandelion each," Gus told them in a quiet voice. "That'll be fine." One girl plucked and handed a dandelion to Doug, then started giggling again. Her friend, with more sense of theater, presented Gus with one using a sweeping gesture and pressed the weed into his palm, only then noticing the clawed fingers, the scaly forearm, and the spurs on his knuckles. She blinked, but still did a bit of a curtsy, as well as wearing jeans aloud. The Lion Knights responded with toothful smiles, leaped up and dashed back to the center of the ring that had formed, never giving the girls the chance to see how tall they were. They made a show of tucking the dandelions behind their pointed ears, then held swords and bucklers at the ready. "On 3, Doug barked. 1, Gus roared. 2, 3. Swords crashed on bucklers, swung again, and were parried. The combatants circled, then clashed again, circled again. To some observers, it looked sort of like a dance. To a few observers, it looked a lot like a dance, and they might not have been surprised to learn that the Lion Knights usually performed this with Khachaturian's saber dance racing in the background from the circus loudspeakers. They prowled and stalked each other through the violin passages, leaped and rolled as the timpani would have pounded. In the final descant, they were rolling on the grass, grappling, swords and bucklers lost, then broke apart, sitting on the grass, staring at each other, panting. "Pax?" asked Gus. "Pax," answered Doug. They stood, picked up their swords and bucklers, then bowed to the girls who had given them the dandelions. They faced in opposite directions and bowed to the crowd, which was clapping by now. Finally, they sprinted back into the town hall. Their long trip from the Rockies had given them an experience of public men's rooms that made them the more ready to spend time as giant cats in the underbrush. But the one by the police offices was quite clean and even included a small shower. They shed their dragon cat forms, lung mao they called them, sluiced off and dried with thin towels from their backpacks. "Now we'll see if that works," said Doug as he bound up his hair. "Maybe we won't have to see if it works," Gus replied. They intended to spend the night poking about, investigating, and might want to use their lung mao forms. They had reasoned that if people had seen them as costumed performers earlier in the day, there was less chance that someone who spotted them would simply break out in screams or gunfire. Of course, there remained the question of why they were snooping about at night in costume, but that wasn't necessarily a lethal problem. "Foxes," said Doug. "If we could have talked him into teaching us foxes, we'd be golden." "Yep, some other time." There was a rap at the door, followed immediately by Evertson's entrance. "That was quite a show," he told them, smiling stiffly. "Your whole circus like that?" "We've got several good acts," Doug answered. "A great trapeze team, trick dogs, trick cats, trick riders, a stage magician. How the hell do you work those costumes?" Evertson interrupted. "You look huge in them, and they don't look like anything real, but they look real, if you know what I mean." He smiled again, as if just remembering to, and looked deeply interested. Doug looked blank. Gus smiled back, tried to make it look relaxed, and said, "Oh, it's simple. We just turn into big, shaggy, scaly dragon cats. A lot more comfortable than rubber masks." Evertson's smile was nowhere in sight. "Sorry, sir," said Doug, "but you know the magician never tells." "Magician," said Evertson flatly. Still no smile. Gus hoisted his own smile more firmly into place. "I mean, not that we're stage magicians, but same principle." Evertson stared at him briefly, apparently trying to think of another question, then smiled again. "Got it. Good show." He turned to go. "Hope you find some good camping." "Thank you," they both said to the closing door. Gus waited a few seconds for Evertson's footsteps to fade away, then said, "He suspects us. But what's he suspect us of? Transforming without a license?" "I think he's seen some weird stuff," said Doug. "Enough so that he believes it when he sees it again." He shrugged. Maybe he's even sundered. Theano says a lot of cops are. If you were sundered from the ordinary world, your luck no longer shielded you from supernatural events in the usual way. They hauled their backpacks out into the hallway, exited through a door opening on the street, not the park, and shouldered their loads. They looked around. So, said Gus, was Evertson suggesting we leave town there at the end? Is Abigail a sundown town, you mean? Asked Doug. No fays allowed in town limits after dark? Be that as it may, I propose to come back this afternoon anyway and stay the evening. He stepped out east. Gus nodded and followed. I don't think he meant anything by it. Nothing serious. If he really suspected us of being monsters, I think he'd use something tougher than a veiled threat. True enough. They ambled out of the tree-lined town center, found the highway again, and crossed into the farm country out of Evertson's jurisdiction. Near the town line, they turned down a crossroad running between fields to a small stand of trees near a road sign extolling hybrid corn. There, they hid their packs and headed back to Abigail, this time bound for the library. The library was near the school, made in the same style, of the same tan bricks, clearly meant to form a unit with the school. Unlike the school, it had more trees around it and a little scattering of cars. They entered into the air conditioning and were greeted with, "It's them!" It was the girl who had handed a dandelion to Gus. She was behind the librarian's desk, just now looking up from her phone, which she was showing to a bright-eyed, middle-aged woman rather like Mrs. Kroll, if a bit plumper. She raised her eyebrows and smiled at them. "Are you the gentleman who put on a fencing demonstration in the park earlier today?" the librarian asked. They smiled back. "That's us," Doug said. And he told about their hike to rejoin their circus in Great Bend. Meanwhile, the lady, Angela Moore, according to her desk sign, looked at her daughter's phone. "Those are amazing costumes," she said, to which they said thank you, just as if they had not received those forms as a curse. "And is that actually fencing or dancing? It looks so symmetrical." Gus nodded. "It's dancing. It's actually easier, safer, and looks better if we have all the moves memorized." "Yes, that makes sense. Well, I certainly hope your circus comes to town. I'm glad Hadley caught some of your performance on her phone. Hadley, can you load this down to our computer at home?" Hadley told her mother it was loading up, and of course she could. "What brings you to the library?" "We were looking for town histories," Doug answered. "Nothing ever happened here," Hadley announced. "Hadley?" her mother admonished in an automatic-sounding tone. "Yes, they're in the reference section." She rose and led them deeper into the building. "I'm afraid you couldn't take them out, even if you were residents." Doug nodded. "Sure, we just wanted to get a little local color. It could be useful if the circus comes here." "Good luck," muttered Hadley, which got her a side-eye from Mrs. Moore. It was not a big library. The reference section was 2 bookcases, and the town histories amounted to 2 biographies of Civil War officers and 1 actual history of Abigail, all privately printed. Mrs. Moore dragged Hadley away and left Gus and Doug to look these books over. Gus took the biographies and left the history to Doug. Sometime later, Gus announced, "Neither of these guys lived where Dolores does or anywhere near. Neither has any ghost stories attached to them, had funny talents, or belonged to any funny organizations. At least not as far as I can tell. Thank God for indexes. Hope they were thorough." "Yeah, and all made with no computers." "Well, there's a smidge in the town history. Back in the Depression, 4 families moved into Dolores's future house, way overcrowded even for that time, claimed as tenants by a guy belonging to one of the families. They made a name for themselves, the November Clan. Not a good name either. Beggars, bums, drunks, running little cons, suspected of various thefts. involved in bar fights, rum running, just the sort of people you don't want moving in. Rum runners? Was this prohibition? Yeah, the tag end of it. Prohibition and depression. Really jolly time. Anyway, these November people show up in the history because they got thrown out of town in the only riot Abigail ever saw, unless you count some bar fights that spilled out into the streets back when cattle drives came through here. Seems a November girl made a claim on the mayor's son. I wonder if that means she said he got her pregnant or just that he proposed to her. And one thing led to another. The book doesn't want to give details, and the November clan was run out of town. Gus looked pensive, then asked, "Did the mayor live where Mayor Blackmore lives now?" "Doesn't say. I wouldn't think so. It's not like that house is a mayoral mansion." Doug looked at Gus's expression. "I feel kind of sorry for the November folk. Some fellow feeling." "A pack of outcasts kept on the move? Yeah, me too." Gus pondered a little more. "So one guy claims the rest of the clan as tenants, so it must have been his house. Was he run out of town too? Out of his own house?" "Apparently. The book says the house stood empty to this day, which is," he checked the copyright page, "1950. Doug watched with interest as his friend's face developed a muzzle the better to snarl with. "Down, boy," he said quietly. "Not in front of the mortals." Doug nodded as his face flattened to human again. "I have to wonder if revenge could figure into whatever's going on here." "But nothing much is going on as far as we've found out. There's just a magic hotspot in the house of the town recluse." Gus nodded again and said, "Let's loop in Theano." Soon they had Theano on loudspeaker on Gus's phone, between them on the table. "The November clan, eh?" she mused. 11th month of the year, 9th month of the old calendars, 4 families in the clan. Do you have the exact date of the riot?" Doug supplied it from the book. "Any names?" "The house belonged to Saul Horbinger," Doug replied. "That's it." "All right, I may be able to start cooking with this." "Can you crack into records," Doug asked, "and find the ownership history of that house? Maybe get some more numbers to crunch that way." "Of course. Is there a town newspaper?" "Yeah, the Abigail Tribune. But I'll be surprised if the back issues are online, and it'll take a long time to search otherwise. Just look for the date of the riot. See if anything interesting crops up." "Will do." The newspapers had not been digitized or even microfilmed, but simply stacked in cardboard boxes and left in a small storeroom. The ones from the 1930s had passed yellowing with age and gone on to browning. Doug and Gus found the right box, unpacked the fragile contents delicately, and found the paper that reported the riot. Fortunately, the disturbance was front-page news. They located the right day easily and did not need to open the brittle paper. "Here's the names of the other 3 families anyway," said Gus. Fowler, Pusey, and Lear. He called Theano and read the entire article to her. "Very good. I can hope to pull something out of this by net or by numerology. Did your sample show in the park get any reaction from Dolores Graves?" "Hard to say," answered Doug. "It was hard to keep an eye on her house in the middle of performing. She certainly wasn't hanging on her gate watching." "And we don't know what she looks like," Gus said, "but I don't think she was in the crowd." "Yes, well, I was just hoping. What are you going to do next?" Gus and Doug exchanged glances, then chorused, "Eat." And we'll follow them to the restaurant next time.